wanted to take a couple minutes and talk about something that I thought would be incredibly important for us to discuss this particular week because of an issue that showed up over the weekend. It happens to be an issue that goes pretty deep into the philosophical tradition and happens to be at the core of Christian theology and has been for a very long time. The Latin phrase that maybe some of you have seen about this doctrine is Ordo, Amoris. Now, that's Latin, and that just simply stands for the order of our loves. Now, why is this Christian doctrine in the news right now? Well, a few days ago, Vice President J.D. Vance gave an interview in the context of immigration, and during that interview, he expressed something. He said there is a teaching that goes way back in history. He's correct about that. That goes deep into the church. He's correct about that as well. He called it a hierarchy of loves. And in that interview, he explained it this way. We are intended to love our families first, then extend our love to our neighbors and our community. Then we extend our love to our national neighbors and citizens. And then we extend our love beyond those borders as well to those who are outside of our nation. So it's this order of loves from those who are most close to us to those who are nearby us, a little bit further but still inside of our context, and then we extend our love further out than that. So what he did is he explained in a nutshell something that's been inside of church teaching for a long time. He said the church teaches, he's Catholic, and it's true, the Catholic Church teaches this. It's also true that this is in the Protestant tradition. Luther and Calvin and plenty of others have taught this same kind of doctrine. Now, of course, as soon as he says that, immediately all of the lambasting begins. The one particular example comes from a professor at Yale. His name is Rory Stewart, and this is what he wrote on X in response to Vice President Vance. He said this: a bizarre take on John 15:12 through 13, teaching about loving our neighbor. Less Christian and more pagan tribal. We should start worrying when politicians become theologians, assume to speak for Jesus, and tell us in which order to love. Now, I would say we should become suspicious when professors at Yale start telling us what the Bible teaches, especially if they are professors of the Bible. We need to be very suspicious of that, as a matter of fact. And notice the fear-mongering. It's less Christian and more pagan tribal. What he did is he said, we need to love those who are like us and hate or not love those who are not like us. It's not what he said, but of course that's part of the reaction to Vice President Vance. Well, he, of course, goes further than that, and many of you saw your friends on social media who are progressive leftists go on to call J.D. Vance a racist for saying this. Well, if they're not like us, then clearly he says we're not supposed to love them, deport them. This is in the context of immigration, so clearly he's racist. Well, that's a very silly and loaded take on this as well. And then the progressive left Christian choir all took up the same song at the same time. And they said, well, someone needs to go teach Vice President Vance about the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which Jesus teaches us to love those and even sacrificially love those who are not like us. Well, who's right? What's going on here? What is this doctrine of ordered loves? Is this criticism involving the parable of the Good Samaritan? Is this right? What do we do with all of this? So, first of all, let's talk about the doctrine itself of our ordered loves. This is a brief description of the doctrine itself. We are, as Christians, commanded to love all people, but there are some who have a special claim on our love, meaning especially our resources, our time, our sacrifice. They have a special claim on our love over others. So it is biblical and it is rational to order our loves in that fashion. There are people that God has put in my life that have this close, they are physically close to me, spiritually, emotionally close to me. You see, God has put people in my life, and then as a follower of Christ, he commands me to love all people. But there's folks that he's put in my life who have a special draw on that love because of how close they are to me. God has put them inside of my life. There are plenty of others that I am called to love who I don't see nearly as often, or I don't ever see, or I don't ever know. I'm called to love them as well. It's entirely rational to try to make sense of the difference between those two things, and it turns out to be entirely biblical as well. The Apostle Paul, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, he says, "But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So Paul says it is the job of the believer, first and foremost, to take care of those who are closest to them. And if they refuse to do what they can for their kids, their parents, their immediate family, they've actually turned their back on the faith. I mean, that's pretty significant. So the doctrine goes back into Greek philosophy. You can find versions of this in Plato and Aristotle. But the church has taught this, and has taught this specifically from very early on. The church father Augustine, in his book, The City of God, speaks of our rightly ordered loves. And that especially when we put kind of an order to a priority to who do we love first, he says if we love God first, then that's going to help make sense of everything else that we're intended to love. If we do not love God first, then all of the rest of those loves are going to be corrupted and they're going to be misordered. And so he says the order of our loves begins with God. And then our loves get rightly ordered after that. So in the most fundamental of senses, our very first love has to be God. And when he's in that right place, then everything else falls into place. So our first love is God. So Augustine teaches that in the 400s AD. And then Aquinas, one of the most prolific theologians of the medieval church, Aquinas goes on to develop this a lot more specifically. And he says a couple of really interesting things. Recognizing that Christians are called to love absolutely everybody, he says this: we owe everyone charity, something that he calls a generic love, in the sense that we want their salvation and their good. And when it is in our capacity to work for that, then we work for that, for their salvation and for their good. And so we're showing Christian charity and Christian love to those we may never actually see, but if there's something we can do to encourage their salvation and their good, we do so, because we're called to love everybody. But God put people in our close orbit so that we can learn to love them more often and in more intense and unique ways. This is actually part of the building of love inside of the Christian heart, is learning how to do this with those who are near to us. So we just love these people differently than we do others. So if you look up or you study or you Google Ordo, Amoris, and you start reading different folks on it, it's not going to be uncommon for people to produce a certain kind of list. Well, here's a way of looking at the order of our loves inside of Christian doctrine. Every list is going to be slightly different, but every list contains this same truth at the core of it. We're starting with those that God has put nearest to me, meaning God has given me the most responsibility for them, to learn how to love them. And then there's a circle that's just right outside of that, and I'm still responsible to show that love as much as I possibly can, and then the circle kind of widens and widens from there. One possible list like this is, of course, we begin with God, and we learn what it is to love God first and foremost, and then family and extended family, those who are nearest to our daily lives, closest to our emotional health and strength and well-being, and whom we have the most influence over. These people are nearest to us in our family and extended family. Then you've got this kind of circle of friends and spiritual family, and depending on our own lives and context and relationships, That friendship and spiritual family, that's going to be pretty tight. It's going to be critical that a church learns how to love each other well, that we learn how to love friends well. This is one of the actual loves inside of Scripture. Then neighborhood and community, those who might even be physically around us or ideologically near to us and we see or interact with. From time to time, what does it look like to love them? Well, it's Christian love, but it's different than the way I would love my spouse, but I'm intended to love them. And then our nation, and then that love spills out even further as we are able to do so. At no point in that list is this tribal, is this racist, is this intended to teach that, well, you really only love these people, but these people we hate. At no instant does that teaching include that. Vice President Vance didn't even hint at that. It's actually really sloppy to say so. And in fact, anytime someone with a PhD starts telling you what to think about the Bible, you should stop and do your own thinking first. Because typically, it's more like children insulting each other on a playground and then running away than it is like someone who is actually interacting with the text and with their own rationality either way. So the doctrine does not tell us to not love others, but to rightly order our loves. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, it teaches this radical love of Jesus Christ. He is handing humanity something unique when he gives the parable of the Good Samaritan. Our love belongs to someone who is even outside of my community, someone who my community might even typically dislike or hate or actively repel. In the parable of the Good Samaritan almost literally stumbles upon someone in need. He is physically near. He is physically and financially capable of taking care of that individual. And so whatever it is that he has on him, he takes care of that person. And it does not matter what nation he belongs to, what linguistic group he belongs to. Christ is teaching something radical, is that the Christian loves everybody, and when you have an opportunity to do it, you show that person a unique kind of love, right? But it tortures the passage, the parable, to say that it teaches that I need to love everyone in exactly the same way. I can't love my child the same way I love a South American dictator. I shouldn't love my physical neighbor in the same way that I would love, say, a drug or sex slave trader who lives a couple of blocks away. I shouldn't. It's irrational, and it is unbiblical to do so. So the reasonableness and the sound biblical foundation of this doctrine makes the progressive Christian's refusal to stand up for their actual neighbors that much more incredible. All of a sudden, the progressive world is concerned about biblical application in the public square and in politics, but I haven't been ready to lift a finger or a voice or a tweet or a post when it comes to gangs overrunning apartment complexes in Aurora, Colorado, for instance, right? So it makes a certain groups of people, their inability to actually want to love their near neighbors that much more incredible. They reverse rational behavior and work against, eventually, Christian virtue in the name of always, of course, being the most virtuous among us. The doctrine itself, though, friends, a couple of minutes with it, and then a little bit more time with it as we think it through, becomes something really beautiful and precious and powerful. A robust theory, a robust theology of Christian love is at once radical and full of common sense. We love everyone. We desire everyone's good according to God's good, and we desire everyone's salvation. And when we are able to work toward that as Christians and as a church, this is what we do. But then we learn that God's put certain people near to us so that we learn how to love those who are close to us with an intense and sacrificial love that is often unique to those very close relationships. All right, friends, I wanted to make sure we got this one in just because it is in the air right now. And I just love the fact that we're in a situation right now where we get to talk about this stuff because of an interview with a politician who actually states and describes Christian doctrine. So it's good for us to talk this through, read some scripture to make sense of it. God bless you guys. I hope we have a wonderful night.